Dear Mother, just a few lines giving you as well as I can the account of our trip so far. Leaving Sydney, we encountered fairly heavy weather until next day, when the sea became as smooth as a mill pond. Most of the crew were very sick half an hour after leaving the heads. To date, all hands are A1. There have been 2 accidents altogether, a broken ankle and a revolver accident. One of the officers' orderlies, while cleaning the revolver, was careless enough to leave it loaded. We have plenty of music aboard and have concerts and boxing each night. It is really marvellous how the time flies. There is no room aboard for musketry drill. Lectures and physical drill occupy most of our time. We expect to reach Albany about Sunday, all going well, where I believe we will stay 3 or 4 days to pick up the rest of the transports. There will be somewhere between 20 and 30 convoys. So with the escort, we should have the appearance of a floating city. With all hands, we have about 1,400 men aboard. All the troops are supplied with hammocks, which are fearfully uncomfortable. The first night out, I slept in mine, but have taken to the floor ever since. You must excuse me the riding, Mother, as we were all inoculated yesterday again. With the stiff arm and the roll of the vessels, 'tis rather awkward. We are being fairly well fed. For breakfast, porridge, chops, coffee. Today being Friday, we had fish dinner, soup, sometimes mutton and roast beef. For tea, bread, plenty of butter and jam. Beer once a day, 11 o'clock being most acceptable. Dare say this will be the last chance of riding you until we reach our destination. We have plenty of reading material and games of all descriptions. Gambling is very frequent. We haven't sighted land since Tuesday. I've seen plenty of sharks and a whale. We have 3 barbers aboard, 3 of the troops. One is a Singleton fella. Well, Mother, I'm afraid I'm out of news until tomorrow, so we'll sign off for the present with love. May strike something interesting to relate tomorrow. Your loving son, Keith.
We were formed up on deck in full marching order, chiefly consisting of 3 days' ration of biscuits and bully, a bottle of water, which would perhaps have to last us 3 days, and 200 rounds of ammunition and necessary clothing. As we passed down the ladder into the boats, each man was given a good stiff rum. We packed ourselves into the boats, which held 60 of us, just like sardines in a tin. All the time we were moving in the boats, not a man even whispered or coughed or stirred. All that could be heard by those close to the pinnace was the very gentle tick-tick of the engine, no louder than that of a watch. Without a sound, the pinnaces cast off their boats and the men told off to row, put their oars in the water. And as soon as they touched the water, one single rifle shot was fired by a Turk from the top of the hill. There was a second's pause, 2 more shots, and a signal light, followed by one continuous hail of bullets. To go through it was just the same as going through a hailstorm without one piece hitting you. As soon as we reached the shore, we laid down flat on the ground and removed our packs from our backs. I was the extreme left flank man, a position which I might say does not give a man a feeling of safety. We probably lay on the beach for the space of half a minute, and somebody gave a yell, which was taken up by everyone at the top of their voices. And off they went to chase the Turk from his hold. What with this noise and the cracks of the Turk's rifles, it was just a terrible nightmare. It was not till I was 2/3 up the cliff that I saw a Turk. On reaching the top, a jacko's head appeared out of a trench a few feet from me, and the chap alongside, who had disobeyed orders by loading his rifle, gave him a bullet point blank, and the Turk fell back, wounded. That was the first one of the enemy that I had been close to. While lying there, one of our naval seaplanes flew over at a couple of 100 feet, so the Turks opened fire on it. And the roar of the rifles, it was the fiercest we had heard up until that time, and I shall never forget it. After the plane got away, they started to advance on us, so we held them up long enough for 9 men at our rear to take up a position. After lying there for about an hour, they came on with a rush, and our officer ordered us to retire, which we did at post-haste speed. Some of our party went back to either flanks, and the remainder straight back the way they came, which proved to be the best, because those who went to the flanks never returned. Going back, I don't think I ever ran so hard before in my life. Mind, I was carrying then about 150 rounds of ammunition, 3 days of soaking wet rations, my rifle, and I was drenched. So perhaps you may have an idea how difficult it was to get away, and especially when a machine gun was chasing you. The time then was about 1 a.m., 25th of April, 1915. The enemy were coming on us in large numbers, so the only thing we could do was fight to the finish.
At 4:30, the wounded commenced to arrive. I shall never forget the shock when we saw the men arrive covered in blood, most of them with half their uniform shot or torn away. By night we had over 500 patients and only 3 nurses and 2 orderlies to cope with the work. The meals had to be got and the wounded were clamouring to be dressed. There was no pause in the admissions. They kept coming in 7 at a time. Soon all our beds were full and new ones were being brought in and put in every available corner. There was no pack store and the men had to put their kits under their beds, and most of the kits were covered and stiff with blood and were crawling with lice. I must have done 400 dressings, no pause for refreshments. These wounded men had been injured during the landing. We are all suffering from shock. The wounds are terrible. The boys are such bricks about it too. They tell terrible tales of the cruelty of the Turks. Some of the injuries will mean amputation of the limbs. Some of the light horse boys came along in their time off and lent a hand. 2 in particular gave up their whole days to making beds and helping me generally. They were invaluable. By this time we had really very ill cases. We could not nurse them. They were lying there in misery, and some so weak and miserable the tears were flowing. The flies swarmed over them, and the heat was suffocating, and we could not get enough food for them. I went to bed heartbroken. They have terrible cases in the main hospital. Legs and arms amputated. One man with his jaw and part of neck blown away. They have to nasal feed him. 2 head cases going to die. 2 spinal cases without a hope. Such numbers of the men have injured backs, and such lots of the cases have cerebral abscesses. A Lieutenant Matthews went mad with the horrors of it all. He jumped up shouting and immediately was killed by the Turks. It seems that Matthews had a friend, a major. A party of Turks dressed like Australian officers came up and asked if there was a colonel or major present, that he was wanted for some orders close by. This unsuspecting major went out and the Turks strangled him. They say that the dead from the first battle are still unburied.
We were sent into the firing line at 6 a.m. My first position was 30 yards from the enemy. 50 yards further along, I observed the enemy's fire and also a long line of our own dead along the brow of the hills. We were hustled into the trenches last night at about 10 p.m. as an attack was expected from the Turks. It came off too at 4 a.m. None of us will ever forget it, I'm sure, as it was our first real fight, and we were in a bad position, being open to an attack on our left flank. The enemy came on in masses to our left towards the New Zealand trenches. It was a poor sort of a charge, the men seeming to huddle together, sometimes advancing a little and then retreating again, just like a mob of sheep being herded along, which we imagine they were by their officers, who were mostly German. We poured into a hot fire, climbing out of our trenches to do so. It was here we lost nearly all our men in the fight, for they had a machine gun trained on that corner. However, our losses were nothing compared to the Turkish. They went down in hundreds. We had a terrible shock this morning. Sergeant Paul, who shares our dugout with us, came in for a snack. And while we were having it, an explosive bullet struck him, almost blowing the top of his head off. Sniper's work, and it goes on all day. Nearly a dozen casualties every day on our way up the gully. At least to be shot in our own dugout in cold blood. It nearly drives one mad. It makes us all feel very sick. Particularly myself, for I was standing behind him and his blood and brains were smashed all over my face. I was standing behind him and his blood and brains were splashed all over my face. And then a few days later it says, I was just cooking breakfast when I was shot by a sniper. The shock was horrific. I felt as if I'd been struck by a shell. There was a hideous crack that probably came by breaking bone, and I knew at once that my thigh had gone. They dragged me back into the shelter and the agony was awful. Our first aid boys put a bandage round it and carried me into the field hospital. They examined and sent me down to the beach, where they put me under chloroform and put in a splint. I was then sent to the hospital ship soon after. I was very pleased when I saw Nurse King, and she told me I was to be her patient. I was put under chloroform again, this time having a wire splint put on. After a conversation with my doctors today, they told me that I would have to have my leg off. Hard luck, but I'm satisfied with his explanation.
I am hardened now and quite used to seeing awful sights. They are awful. Men with heads and arms blown off and shrieking with pain. We sleep under the hill. The fighting is still going on desperately. The Turks are putting up a stubborn resistance and are hard pressing our left flank. 2 of our men out of 12 were hit by shells. The warships are firing over us with approximately 15 guns at the Turks. We're doing great damage. I am out on the left flank with 4 others of our troop. The enemy is bombarding our aerials, so we keep under cover until they finish. Long streams of wounded and dead men are being carried past us. The Turks fire on our Red Cross, so we have been ordered to ignore the white flag. Kill all. At 1 a.m, a Turkish battalion of 900 men and 9 machine guns were captured by the Australians. Great joy. We're now getting a bit of our own back. In our 3rd Brigade of 5,000 men, Australians are almost wiped out. There will be some aching hearts when the list goes out. We are under very heavy shrapnel fire all day. Bullets are falling on the bags over my head. Needless to say, I'm well behind the bags. 2 donkeys tied up to a cart alongside us were killed, and our camp was damaged. The warships are bombarding the Turks' batteries as I write this. Shell is bursting all around me, knocking the sand out of the barricade. I thank God I've been spared so far. The Turks are murdering all our wounded as they get them. The position is very favourable on our side. 3 horses, 2 men have just been shot alongside me. Some of our escapes have been miraculous.
Dearest people, there is really nothing to write about this week. There is nothing but work to discuss. We've been very busy to the last 48 hours, and now we're expecting in 100 cot cases, meaning in the language of the military, bad cases. We are sending every patient who is able to travel to England tomorrow. My nice New Zealand and Australian boys are off with them. I shall miss them very much. They've been longing to go to England, so yesterday the Colonel came round with papers to fill in, getting the names of all the men who could go. Poor men. I hate to think of them going back again. You know, it's only when you get tales firsthand like we do here, from the men who have been right through it, that you begin to realise the least little bit of what it is like. I must tell you the story of a poor RAMC man that somehow made me think of Mr. Andrews. This man got hold of a donkey and used to go backwards and forwards to the firing line, and putting the wounded on the donkey would convey him to the first aid place. For a fortnight, he was known all along the line as the man with a donkey, and as he passed, the men would cheer him. But one day he never passed, and then they found him. He and the donkey were dead. A hospital ship from the Dardanelles came in the day before yesterday, but the men were beautifully cleaned and well looked after, as they had 9 or 10 sisters on board, which makes all the difference. When they just come over on a transport, they arrive in filthy conditions, poor dears. They are simply crowded on, lie on deck, or stretchers, or anything, with about 2 or 3 sisters and 2 doctors for hundreds of men, and they simply cannot look after them. Consequently, they are fearfully septic, and limbs have to be amputated that might have been saved. It's appalling, the number of amputations that have to be done. We've just heard of the death of 2 Australian doctors, just young boys. One from Melbourne had been in England for 6 years and got back just when the war broke out. He was very clever and quite one of the coming surgeons. He was shot through the spine, lived for 2 days, completely paralysed, then died. They used to call him Demure Smith. He was shot through the head, but when they tried to find his body, they could not. It has never been found. Oh dear, if this ghastly war would only end. Somehow one feels at times that things can never be the same again for years to come. People look at things differently and be different. I must stop now. Oceans of love. From Nari.
Dear Renee, expect you've seen the list of casualties long before this reaches you, and noticed that yours truly got in the way of a bullet. Couldn't help it, really. Didn't see it coming, to tell you the truth. We advanced in open formation a mile or so forward across deserted fields of grain and open green spaces covered with glorious wildflowers, poppies, buttercups, marguerites. The picture only being marred in places by a dead body here and there. We had seen so many of these that we passed by them without comment of any sort, except to remark that it was high time they were buried. Before we'd left the shelter of the bed at the creek, a chap alongside me, sitting on a bit of dirt, suddenly fell forward without a sound into the water. Poor bugger. He'd got a stray bullet through his head. Must have lifted myself up a little from the ground in doing so, for in about 3 seconds I felt as if someone had thrown the Melbourne Town Hall at me and hit me in the shoulder and back. The force of the hit pinned me face down in the ground, stunned me for a few moments, and then when I lifted my head, blood gushed out of my mouth in a stream. My first thought was not a home, or loved ones, curiously enough, but a sort of peaceful feeling came over me, and the thought ran through my mind: how easy it is to die. The chap on my right turned me over on my back and took off my wet equipment, meanwhile assuring me that he couldn't see any blood on the back of my tunic, so I knew then it was a bullet, and that it had come in the front and gone out the back. The blood had stopped coming out in a stream now, and I was only coughing it up, but the stunned feeling had passed, and it began to be painful somewhat. By this time, I'd given up the idea of dying, and I thought if I could get back to the cover of the trenches, I'd get my wound dressed and it might be more comfortable than my present position. I had a small round hole about as big as a lead pencil in diameter on my left shoulder, and a bigger one at the back of the shoulder blade. By this time, the sun was just setting, and the blood-red rays tinged the faces of the dead who turned their faces to the sky for the last time. A little group round a wounded man, doctors and a couple of orderlies, the temporary blood-soaked bandages tenderly unwrapped, and the light of an electric torch on the wound, and you're turned away with a taste in your mouth. One gets used to seeing blood, but when you see some of the wounds caused by the soft-nosed bullets which those inhuman devils used, you taste blood and long to avenge your fallen comrades with the point of the bayonet. We'll just ask you here, in case you see any of my people, don't let them read this, as the descriptions might be too detailed for them. We'll be getting back to the field again soon, so that letter writing on my part will be at an end, though not permanently, I hope. And we'll look forward to more of your letters. With best wishes and regards from your old pal, Bert. Don't tell any of my people I wrote you so much.